Sometimes the most extraordinary moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary choices. Picture this: a single father, exhausted from working double shifts just to keep the lights on, hears desperate knocking on his apartment door at 2 a.m. during a thunderstorm. Most people would ignore it, call the police, or pretend they didn't hear anything. But what if that one decision to open the door changed not just your life, but revealed a truth so shocking it would make international headlines? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about David Thompson, a 34-year-old construction worker from Detroit, Michigan, who made a choice that exposed one of the most disturbing cases of family control and manipulation involving billions of dollars. This isn't just another feel-good story about helping your neighbor. This is about what happens when ordinary human decency collides with extraordinary circumstances, and how sometimes the person you think needs saving ends up being your salvation. David never imagined that the woman crying behind his door was worth more than the GDP of small countries. He had no idea that his cramped two-bedroom apartment was about to become the center of a legal battle that would make front pages across America. All he knew was that someone needed help, and despite having every reason to protect himself and his 8-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room, he chose compassion over caution. What happened next would challenge everything you think you know about wealth, family, and the price of doing what's right. Because sometimes, when you save someone else, you discover that you've been the one who needed saving all along. And sometimes, the most powerful people in the world are actually the most powerless of all. If you've never subscribed to our channel, this story will show you exactly why millions of people trust us to bring you the most incredible true stories of human resilience and unexpected justice. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. David Thompson's story begins on a Tuesday night in November, when the first winter storm of the season was battering Detroit with freezing rain and winds that made the old apartment building creak like a ship in rough seas. David had just gotten home from his second job at the warehouse, his work boots still muddy from the construction site where he'd spent the morning fixing foundation problems for a downtown office building. His hands were raw from the cold, his fingertips cracked and bleeding from handling steel beams without proper gloves because the company-issued ones had worn through weeks ago, and replacement requests kept getting lost in bureaucratic delays. His back ached from lifting concrete blocks for 12 hours straight, each one weighing 60 pounds and leaving his muscles screaming for rest. The physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the mental weight he carried. Every step up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment felt like climbing a mountain, not because of tired legs, but because each step brought him closer to another evening of impossible mathematics. Trying to make $23 stretch to cover groceries for the next 3 days until his next paycheck arrived. The electricity bill was 3 weeks overdue, and the notice tucked under his door that afternoon had been final: $237. The number haunted him like a curse. It might as well have been $2,000 for all the chance he had of paying it before the deadline. David sat at his kitchen table, calculator in hand, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that would never quite fit together. Rent took 60% of his income. Groceries, when he bought the cheapest options available, consumed another 20%. Emma's school supplies, her growing feet that needed new shoes every few months, gas for his beat-up Ford pickup that burned oil and threatened to die every time he started it. No matter how he arranged the figures, there was always more month than money. The apartment itself told the story of a man trying to provide dignity in circumstances that offered little. David had painted the walls himself with discount paint from the hardware store, choosing warm colors that would make the cramped space feel more like a home. He'd built furniture from scrap materials he brought home from construction sites, teaching himself carpentry through YouTube videos watched on his cracked phone screen during lunch breaks. The kitchen table where he now sat had been assembled from reclaimed wood and metal brackets, sanded smooth by hand and stained with care. It wobbled slightly, but it was theirs. Emma was already asleep in the bedroom they shared, her homework spread across the small desk David had built from scrap wood he'd brought home from job sites. Math worksheets filled with careful handwriting, her pencil marks betraying the pressure of someone who wanted to get every answer perfect. She never complained about their cramped living situation, never asked why other kids in her class had their own rooms or why Daddy worked so much. At 8 years old, she possessed a wisdom that broke David's heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. Emma understood, without being told, that their life was held together by her father's determination, and that complaining would only add to his burden. The single bedroom contained a bunk bed David had assembled from a kit he'd found at a garage sale. Emma slept on the bottom bunk, surrounded by drawings she'd made that covered the walls like colorful wallpaper. Pictures of stick-figure families, houses with crooked chimneys, rainbows that stretched across entire sheets of construction paper. David slept on the top bunk, his 6-foot frame cramped in a space designed for children, but it was the only way to give Emma some sense of having her own space in their tiny world. The knocking started at exactly 2:17 a.m. David knew the time because he'd been staring at the ceiling, calculator app still open on his phone, trying to figure out if he could pick up a third job on weekends without losing the overtime hours at the construction site. The sound jolted him upright, his heart immediately racing with the kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing something is wrong. It wasn't the casual rap of a neighbor needing a favor or someone who'd gotten the wrong apartment number. This was urgent, desperate, the kind of knocking that spoke of genuine panic. "Please," came a woman's voice through the thin door, muffled by the storm, but clear enough to hear the terror that made her words shake. "Please, I need help. I can't get out. They locked me in. I'm so cold, please, I just need help." David's first instinct was caution. Detroit wasn't the safest neighborhood, and their building attracted its share of trouble. Drug deals went down in the alley behind the complex, domestic disputes echoed through thin walls, and strange voices at 2 a.m. usually meant someone was either running from trouble or bringing it with them. But something in the woman's tone cut through his wariness like a knife. This wasn't a con artist or someone looking to cause harm. This was pure desperation, the sound of someone who had run out of options and was gambling everything on the kindness of strangers. He glanced toward the bedroom where Emma slept peacefully, her small form barely visible under the thick comforter he'd bought her for Christmas last year, spending money he couldn't afford because he wanted her to have something new and special. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. Whatever decision he made in the next few minutes could affect not just his life, but hers. If he opened that door and let trouble into their home, Emma would pay the price for his choice. But as he listened to the woman's voice through the door, pleading with a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine, David heard something else. The sound of someone's daughter in distress. Someone's child who had nowhere else to turn. How could he ignore that and still look at Emma in the morning, knowing he'd turned away from someone who needed help? He moved quietly to the door, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum floor. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need me to call the police?" "No!" The response was immediate and panicked, followed by the sound of sobbing that she'd apparently been trying to suppress. "No police, please. I just need somewhere safe to make a phone call. My family, they've locked me in the penthouse across the street. I managed to get onto the fire escape, but I can't get back inside and the stairwell door is locked from the outside. I've been trying every apartment in this building for the past hour. You're the first person to answer." David looked through the peephole and saw a woman in what appeared to be expensive clothes, though they were soaked from the rain and clinging to her shivering frame. Her hair was plastered to her head, and even in the dim hallway light he could see she was terrified. But more than that, she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. This was someone who had been fighting battles for so long that the fight was starting to drain out of her. The reasonable thing would have been to call 911 and let professionals handle whatever situation this was. David had Emma to think about, bills to worry about, and no business getting involved in other people's problems. His life was complicated enough without adding mysteries that involved locked penthouses and families wealthy enough to live across the street from his struggling neighborhood. But as he watched the woman through the peephole, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, pressing her back against his door as if she was trying to disappear into it, he thought about all the times he'd needed help and found doors closed in his face. The decision took less than 10 seconds. David unlocked the deadbolt, turned the chain, and opened the door. The woman who stumbled into his apartment looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine despite being drenched and shaking. Her clothes, though soaked, were clearly expensive. The kind of fabric that cost more than David made in a month. A cashmere sweater that probably cost $600, wool pants that had been tailored to fit perfectly, leather shoes that were designed for style rather than the practical walking she'd apparently been doing. Her jewelry, what little she wore, caught the light in a way that suggested real diamonds rather than the costume pieces David was used to seeing. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something David recognized from his own mirror during the hardest times, the look of someone who had been fighting battles others couldn't see, someone who had learned to smile when people were watching, but let their guard down only in private moments when the weight became too much to carry. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know how this must look. I just need to use your phone for one call, and then I'll leave. I promise I won't cause you any trouble." David grabbed a towel from the kitchen and handed it to her, noticing how her hands shook as she took it. "Ma'am, you're hypothermic. Sit down. Let me get you some coffee. The phone can wait 5 minutes." As she wrapped the towel around her shoulders, David noticed her hands more clearly. They were shaking not just from cold, but from what looked like genuine terror. Her fingernails, though perfectly manicured, were bitten down to the quick. There were marks on her wrists that looked like they might have come from restraints, though she quickly pulled her sleeves down when she noticed him looking. Whatever had driven her out into a storm at 2 a.m. was serious enough to risk her life. The apartment's warmth seemed to hit her all at once, and she began crying with the kind of relief that comes from reaching safety after genuine danger. David busied himself making coffee, partly to give her a moment to collect herself, and partly because he needed time to process what was happening. In 10 years of living in this building, the most dramatic thing that had occurred was Mrs. Patterson's car getting broken into last summer. Now he had what appeared to be a wealthy woman sitting in his kitchen, claiming to have escaped from a locked penthouse. "I'm David Thompson," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Emma. "And you're going to tell me what's really going on here, because nobody climbs down fire escapes in freezing rain just to use a stranger's phone." The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could trust him with the truth. Her eyes moved around the apartment, taking in the handmade furniture, the careful organization that spoke of someone making the most of limited space, the photographs of Emma that covered the refrigerator. When her gaze returned to David's face, something in her expression had shifted. "My name is Victoria Ashford," she said. "And if you've ever wondered what happens when you have all the money in the world but no freedom to spend it, you're about to find out." David had never heard the name Victoria Ashford, but something about the way she said it suggested he should have. She sat in his kitchen chair like someone who wasn't used to furniture that came from thrift stores, but she didn't look around his modest apartment with judgment. Instead, she seemed genuinely grateful to be somewhere warm and safe, touching the table's surface with fingers that traced the wood grain as if she was memorizing the texture of something real and honest. "The penthouse across the street," she continued, pointing toward the window that faced the luxury high-rise David had watched being built 3 years earlier. "That's where my brother has been keeping me for the past 8 months. The locks are electronic, controlled by his security team. I'm only allowed out for supervised visits to doctors and lawyers, always with guards who report everything I say and do. Tonight was the first time in months that the system malfunctioned during the storm, and I saw my chance." David stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. The building she was pointing to had apartments that sold for millions of dollars. He'd watched wealthy people in expensive cars come and go from the underground garage, but he'd never imagined that one of those luxury homes was actually a prison. "Your brother is keeping you prisoner in a penthouse?" Victoria's laugh was bitter, the sound of someone who had stopped finding humor in irony months ago. "When you're worth $4.7 billion, it's called protective custody for your own well-being. My brother Richard controls the family trust, and he's convinced everyone that I'm mentally unstable. According to him, and the doctors he's paid to agree with him, I'm a danger to myself and the family fortune." The number hit David like a physical blow, $4.7 billion. He tried to wrap his mind around what that meant, but the concept was so far outside his experience that it felt abstract. He was sitting across from someone who had enough money to solve every problem in his life 1,000 times over, and she was asking him for help because she couldn't even leave her own home. "Why does he want to control you?" David asked, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, one with a chip on the handle that he'd been meaning to replace for months. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "Because I found out what he's been doing with the family foundation. The Ashford Foundation is supposed to be funding children's hospitals, educational programs, disaster relief. We have an annual budget of over $200 million for charitable works. But Richard has been funneling tens of millions into political campaigns and corporate buyouts that benefit his other investments. When I threatened to expose him to the board of directors, he had me declared mentally incompetent." David set the coffee in front of her and watched as she wrapped her hands around the warm mug like it was a lifeline. The steam rose between them, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm continuing to rage outside. "So, you're not actually mentally ill?" "I have anxiety and depression. I've been open about my struggles with mental health since my teens, after our parents died in a car accident. I've been in therapy, I take medication when I need it, and I've learned to manage my conditions. But Richard twisted my therapy records and paid doctors to write reports saying I was delusional and potentially dangerous. He presented evidence to the court that I was planning to give away the entire family fortune to causes that would destabilize the foundation's long-term investments. The courts gave him temporary guardianship while the case is being reviewed, but that was 8 months ago." As Victoria spoke, David began to understand the scope of what she was describing. This wasn't just family drama among the wealthy. This was systematic abuse, using the legal system as a weapon, with billions of dollars at stake. He thought about the stories he'd heard about conservatorships trapping people in legal arrangements they couldn't escape, but he'd never imagined it happening to someone with the resources to fight back. What about other family members, friends? Surely someone with your resources has people who would help. Victoria's expression grew even darker. "Richard is very thorough. He's convinced our extended family that I'm a risk to everyone's inheritance. My friends have been told that I'm unstable and that contact with me could be legally problematic for them. The few people who tried to help found themselves facing lawsuits or having their own businesses targeted by Richard's lawyers. After a few months, everyone stopped trying." David felt anger building in his chest, a hot fury at the injustice of someone using wealth and power to imprison their own family member. He'd faced his share of struggles, but he'd never experienced the kind of systematic isolation Victoria was describing. "What's your plan?" David asked. You can't stay here forever, and if your brother is as powerful as you say, he'll find you." Victoria pulled a small recording device from her pocket, no bigger than a thumb drive. "I've been documenting everything for months. Conversations with Richard, meetings with his lawyers, evidence of the financial fraud. I hide this in different places, and I've been recording whenever I can do it safely. But I need to get this to someone who can't be bought, someone my brother doesn't already have in his pocket." David looked at the device and realized he was holding evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful families in America. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "Who can you trust with this?" "There's a federal prosecutor in Chicago, Sarah Martinez. She's been investigating corporate fraud cases involving charitable foundations, and she's the only person who's turned down job offers from firms that work with my family. Richard tried to have her reassigned to other cases, but she's protected by federal oversight. If I can get this evidence to her, she'll know what to do with it." The plan that formed over the next hour was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. David would drive Victoria to Chicago, a 4-hour trip, while she stayed hidden in his truck. They would avoid major highways and stick to back roads where Richard's security team was less likely to spot them. Once in Chicago, Victoria would turn over her evidence to the prosecutor and request protective custody while the investigation proceeded. It was the kind of plan that could go wrong in 100 different ways. David could lose his job if he didn't show up for work, face legal consequences for helping someone evade what the courts considered legitimate guardianship, or worse. But as he looked at Victoria, still shivering despite the warm apartment, he thought about Emma sleeping in the next room. What kind of father would he be if he taught her, through his actions, that it was acceptable to ignore someone in desperate need just because helping them was inconvenient? "I'll drive you," David said. "But I need to arrange care for my daughter first." Victoria's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "You have a child. I can't ask you to risk that. If something happens to you because you helped me, what happens to your daughter?" "Nothing's going to happen," David said with more confidence than he felt. "My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, watches Emma sometimes when I work late shifts. We'll leave at dawn, and you'll be safe in Chicago by noon." What David didn't know was that across the street, Richard Ashford's security team had been tracking every electronic signal in the building since Victoria's disappearance 3 hours earlier. They had sophisticated equipment that could monitor cell phone usage, internet traffic, and even the electrical patterns that indicated which apartments were occupied. They knew exactly which apartment she was in, and they were already planning their response. Richard Ashford sat in his private office on the 40th floor of the Ashford building, surrounded by windows that offered a panoramic view of Detroit's skyline. At 51, he had the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms and political fundraisers. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit custom-tailored, and his manner suggested someone who had never heard the word no without finding a way to change it to yes. But tonight, his usual confidence was replaced by barely controlled fury. Victoria's escape had disrupted carefully laid plans that had taken months to implement. The conservatorship was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to restructure the foundation's assets in ways that would benefit his broader business interests. Once the reorganization was complete, he had planned to gradually restore Victoria's freedoms while maintaining control over the foundation's direction. Her cooperation had been essential to making the arrangement appear legitimate, and her escape threatened to expose the entire operation. "Sir," his head of security reported through the encrypted communication system, "we've located your sister. She's in apartment 3B of the building across the street. Our thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures indicating she's not alone." Richard's jaw tightened. The building across the street was exactly the kind of place Victoria would run to in her naivety about how the world worked. She'd always had romantic notions about ordinary people and their inherent goodness. never understanding that everyone had a price if you knew how to negotiate it properly. Who lives in that apartment? David Thompson, age 34, construction worker, single father, significant financial difficulties, behind on several bills, no savings to speak of. He has an 8-year-old daughter. Richard smiled for the first time that evening. Financial pressure was something he understood perfectly, and single fathers were particularly vulnerable to the right combination of threats and incentives. This situation might actually work out better than he'd planned. The call came at 6 a.m., just as David was preparing to wake Emma. His phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered, a smooth male voice spoke with the kind of authority that was used to being obeyed. "Mr. Thompson, this is Richard Ashford. I believe you have something that belongs to me." David's blood went cold. Victoria was in the bathroom, preparing for the journey, and Emma was still asleep in the bunk bed, her breathing deep and peaceful, the sound of innocence that he was determined to protect. "I don't know what you're talking about. My sister is a very sick woman, Mr. Thompson. She's been off her medication for several days, and she becomes delusional when that happens. She's probably told you all sorts of stories about being held against her will, but the truth is that she's in need of immediate medical attention." The voice was calm, reasonable, the tone of someone explaining a simple misunderstanding to a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of adult situations. But David could hear the threat underneath, like steel wrapped in velvet. "She seemed perfectly rational to me." "I'm sure she did. Victoria is very good at appearing normal when she wants something. It's one of the symptoms of her condition. But I have court documents showing that I'm her legal guardian, and I'm requesting that you return her to my care immediately. If you refuse, I'll have to involve law enforcement, and I think we both know that would be unfortunate for everyone involved." David looked toward the bathroom door, where he could hear water running, as Victoria prepared for what might be the most important day of her life. "And if I do return her, then this whole unfortunate incident disappears. No police reports, no legal consequences for you. I might even be inclined to show my appreciation for your cooperation. I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. Perhaps we could discuss ways to resolve those issues." The implication was clear. Richard was offering a bribe in exchange for his sister's freedom. Under different circumstances, David might have been tempted. The money could solve all his immediate problems, give Emma a better life, provide the kind of security he'd been chasing for years without success. But as he thought about Victoria's terrified eyes and the evidence she carried of her brother's crimes, David realized that some choices define who you are as a person. This was one of those moments that would echo through the rest of his life, influencing not just his own future, but the kind of man Emma would remember her father being. "Mr. Ashford," David said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "I think you should call the police yourself. I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing about all of this." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 10 seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of politeness. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Mr. Thompson. I can destroy your life with a single phone call. I can have you fired from both your jobs, evicted from your apartment, investigated by Child Protective Services. I can make sure you never work in construction again, anywhere in this state. Is helping my delusional sister really worth losing your daughter?" The threat hit David like a punch to the stomach. Emma was everything to him, and the idea of losing her was more terrifying than any physical danger he might face. But as fear flooded through him, David thought about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to remember. Did he want her to know that when faced with injustice, her father had chosen the safe path? Or did he want to show her that standing up for what's right was worth any personal cost? "Mr. Ashford," David said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, If you're so confident that your sister is mentally ill and you're acting in her best interests, then you won't mind having that conversation with federal investigators instead of me." David hung up the phone and immediately called Mrs. Rodriguez. Within 20 minutes, Emma was safely next door with explicit instructions not to answer the door for anyone except her father. Victoria emerged from the bathroom, looking terrified but determined, carrying a small backpack that contained everything she owned that wasn't controlled by her brother's security team. "He called you, didn't he?" she said, reading the tension in David's expression. "Your brother is exactly what you said he was," David replied, "which means we need to leave now before he decides to escalate this beyond phone calls." The drive to Chicago took place on back roads through rural Michigan and Indiana, with Victoria hidden under a tarp in the truck bed for the first 50 miles until they were far enough from Detroit to reduce the risk of being spotted by Richard's security team. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and every car that appeared in his rearview mirror made his heart race. The truck's radio played classic rock at low volume, but neither of them was really listening to the music. As they put distance between themselves and Detroit, Victoria began to relax enough to tell David more of her story. She talked about growing up with unlimited resources but no real freedom, about parents who viewed their children as extensions of the family brand rather than individuals with their own dreams and aspirations. She described the moment she realized that Richard saw her not as a sister, but as an obstacle to his complete control of the family empire. "The saddest part," Victoria said as they drove through small farming communities, where the only signs of life were silos and farmhouses set back from the road, "is that I genuinely loved him once. When we were kids, before the money became everything, Richard was actually a good brother. He taught me to ride a bike, helped me with math homework, scared away boys who were mean to me at school. But power changes people, and absolute power changes them absolutely." David found himself sharing parts of his own story as the miles passed. The divorce that had left him as Emma's sole guardian when his ex-wife decided that parenthood was too restrictive for the life she wanted to lead. The jobs he'd lost during economic downturns. The constant struggle to provide stability for his daughter while dealing with his own fears about the future. The nights he'd lain awake, calculating bills, wondering if love and determination were enough to give Emma the life she deserved. "You know what's funny?" Victoria said as they passed through a small town where the main street was lined with shops that had been closed for years. "You have something my brother will never understand. You know what it means to sacrifice for someone else without expecting anything in return. That's not something money can buy, and it's not something you can learn from business school or board meetings." They reached Chicago at 1 p.m., and federal prosecutor Sarah Martinez agreed to see them immediately after Victoria's call. The meeting took place in a secure conference room in the federal building with recording equipment and 2 FBI agents present as witnesses. What happened in that room over the next 3 hours would later be described by legal experts as one of the most significant white-collar crime breakthroughs in decades. Victoria's recordings didn't just expose Richard's embezzlement from the family foundation. They revealed a network of corruption involving politicians, judges, and corporate executives that reached into the highest levels of American power. The evidence she had gathered over 8 months of captivity was so comprehensive that within hours of the meeting, federal agents were executing search warrants on properties across 3 states. Richard Ashford was arrested at his Detroit office that evening, charged with fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and false imprisonment. The story dominated national headlines for weeks, with financial news networks running detailed analyses of how the corruption had operated and legal experts debating the implications for other family trusts and foundations. But for David, The most important moment came when Victoria was officially declared competent by an independent medical evaluation ordered by federal judge, and her brother's guardianship was terminated. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to resolve, but Victoria was finally free to make her own decisions about her life and her resources. The story doesn't end with Richard's arrest or Victoria's freedom, though. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from what we receive, but from what we give. Victoria insisted on returning to Detroit to thank David personally and to meet Emma. When she knocked on his door 3 weeks later, she came not as a desperate woman seeking refuge, but as someone transformed by the experience of being treated with simple human dignity when she needed it most. Emma answered the door this time, having been told that a special friend of Daddy's was coming to visit. The 8-year-old looked up at Victoria with curious eyes that held no awareness of wealth or status, only the open interest of a child meeting someone new. "Are you the lady Daddy helped?" Emma asked, with the directness that only children possess. "I am," Victoria said, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "And I came to thank both of you for being so brave and kind." "Daddy says helping people is what you're supposed to do," Emma replied matter-of-factly, "even when it's scary." Victoria's eyes filled with tears at the simple wisdom of a child who had been raised to believe that kindness was not optional, even in difficult circumstances. "I have a proposition for you," Victoria said to David once they were seated in his kitchen, though this time she wasn't shivering or afraid. "I'm restructuring the family foundation, and I need someone to oversee our construction and housing initiatives, someone who understands what it means to work with your hands, who knows the difference between a house and a home." David stared at her, not sure he'd heard correctly. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a career. The position pays $200,000 a year, plus benefits, plus a housing allowance that would let you and Emma live wherever you choose. You'd be responsible for overseeing the construction of affordable housing projects, ensuring they're built with integrity and attention to the needs of families like yours." The number was so far beyond David's experience that he couldn't immediately process it. $200,000 was more than he'd made in the past 5 years combined. But it was Victoria's next words that truly moved him. "I'm not offering you this job because I owe you," she said. "I'm offering it because in the past 8 months of my captivity, I watched dozens of people walk past opportunities to help me because it wasn't convenient or safe or profitable. Lawyers who could have questioned the legitimacy of Richard's guardianship, doctors who could have provided independent evaluations, family friends who could have asked uncomfortable questions. You were the only person who opened his door because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of integrity I need in someone who's going to be handling millions of dollars meant to help families in need." David accepted the position, and within 6 months, he and Emma had moved into a modest house in a safe neighborhood with excellent schools. Emma got her own room, decorated with art supplies and books, and a desk where she could do homework without worrying about bothering her father. David got something he'd never had before, the security of knowing that his daughter's future was no longer dependent on whether he could find enough overtime hours to pay the bills. But the most significant change wasn't financial. David discovered that his experience with Victoria had given him a perspective on wealth and power that was invaluable in his new role. He understood the difference between charity that makes the giver feel good and aid that actually addresses the root causes of poverty. Under his oversight, the Ashford Foundation's housing projects became models for sustainable community development, incorporating job training programs, childcare facilities, and educational resources that helped families build long-term stability rather than just providing temporary relief. Victoria, meanwhile, used her freedom to become one of the most effective philanthropists of her generation. She established partnerships with organizations that had been overlooked by traditional charity networks, focusing on programs that addressed systemic issues rather than just symptoms. But she never forgot the lesson she learned in David's kitchen, that sometimes the most valuable thing you can offer someone isn't money, but the simple recognition of their humanity. The two families remained close, with Emma and Victoria developing a bond that transcended their different backgrounds. Victoria often said that Emma taught her more about resilience and joy than all her expensive therapy sessions combined, while David credited Victoria with showing him that his instinct to help others, even when it was inconvenient, was actually his greatest strength. Emma thrived in her new school, making friends easily and excelling in subjects that had been difficult when she was worried about her father's stress levels. She joined the art club and the science team, participated in activities that had been impossible when every decision had to be weighed against its cost. But more importantly, she grew up knowing that her father was someone who had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. Richard Ashford was eventually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $2 billion. The corruption network his prosecution exposed led to dozens of additional arrests and significant reforms in how family trusts and foundations are regulated. Congressional hearings examined the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed such widespread abuse to continue for years without detection. But for David and Victoria, the real victory wasn't Richard's downfall. It was the discovery that in a world where money often determines worth, there are still people willing to measure value by different standards. 3 years after that storm-swept night in Detroit, David stood in front of the latest Ashford Foundation housing project, watching families move into homes that had been built with the same attention to detail he'd once given to Emma's desk, made from scrap wood. Victoria stood beside him, no longer the terrified woman who had knocked on his door in the middle of the night, but someone who had learned to use her resources to create the kind of security for others that she had never known herself. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked, watching a young mother help her children plant flowers in the garden space that was part of every Ashford Foundation housing development. "Opening the door that night? Your life would have been simpler if you'd just ignored the knocking." David watched Emma playing with a group of children in the playground of the housing complex, her laughter carrying across the construction site where workers were putting finishing touches on the community center that would serve as the heart of the development. She was teaching younger children how to use the monkey bars, displaying the same patient kindness that David had tried to model for her throughout their struggles. "Simpler, maybe," he said, his voice carrying the weight of reflection. "But not better, not for any of us." The lesson David Thompson learned that November night wasn't about the rewards of helping others, though those had been extraordinary beyond anything he could have imagined. It was about the realization that our greatest moments of growth come not from what life gives us, but from what we choose to give to life, especially when giving feels impossible. Victoria had learned something equally profound. She discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the connections we forge with people who see us as human beings rather than opportunities or obstacles. The months she'd spent trapped in luxury had taught her that all the money in the world couldn't buy the feeling of safety that came from sitting in David's kitchen, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, and being treated with simple human decency. The Ashford Foundation, under Victoria's leadership and David's operational oversight, became a model for how wealth could be used to create lasting change rather than temporary relief. They focused on programs that addressed root causes of poverty, job training that led to actual employment, housing developments that became communities rather than just buildings, educational initiatives that prepared people for economic mobility rather than dependency. Emma, now 11 years old, often accompanied her father to construction sites and foundation meetings. She had grown up seeing how individual choices could ripple outward to affect hundreds of families, and she understood in ways that most children never would that kindness was not a luxury, but a necessity for a functioning society. "When I grow up," she told Victoria one afternoon as they watched families moving into a new housing development, "I want to help people like you and Daddy do." What kind of help do you want to give?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious about the perspective of someone who had witnessed both struggle and success from such a unique vantage point. Emma considered the question seriously, watching a father help his daughter ride a bike in the courtyard of their new home. "I want to help people remember that everyone matters," she said finally. "Even when they look different or live different or don't have as much money, I think sometimes people forget that." Victoria smiled, recognizing in Emma's words the wisdom that comes from being raised by someone who had never forgotten that fundamental truth, even during the hardest times. The impact of that single decision to open a door had extended far beyond David and Victoria's lives. The prosecution of Richard Ashford had exposed a network of corruption that led to legislative reforms protecting vulnerable adults from conservatorship abuse. The Ashford Foundation's housing projects had created thousands of jobs and provided stable homes for families who had been trapped in cycles of poverty. Most importantly, the story had inspired countless other acts of kindness by people who had heard about an ordinary man who chose to help a stranger despite having every reason to protect himself. 5 years after their first meeting, David and Victoria sat in the same kitchen where their friendship had begun, though now it was in David's new house in a neighborhood where Emma could walk to school safely and children played in yards without worry. The furniture was new, but David had kept the handmade table from their old apartment, not because he couldn't afford better, but because it represented something important about where they'd come from and how far they'd traveled together. "I still have the recording device," Victoria said, pulling the small piece of technology from her purse. "Sometimes I listen to those conversations with Richard just to remind myself how different things could have been." "Do you think he understands what he lost?" David asked. Victoria shook her head slowly. "I think Richard still believes that the only thing that matters is controlling resources. He'll probably spend his entire prison sentence convinced that he was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of his own downfall. Some people never learn that power over others is an illusion, but the power to help others is real." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Emma practice piano in the next room. The music was tentative but earnest, each note carefully considered, much like the approach to life her father had taught her through his example. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door," Victoria mused. "If I'd given up after the first few apartments, or if the storm had been too severe to risk climbing down the fire escape." "But you did knock," David replied, "and that's what matters. We can't control all the circumstances that lead us to crucial moments, but we can control what we do when we reach them." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's arrival in the kitchen, sheet music in hand and a frustrated expression on her face. "This piece is too hard," she announced, flopping into a chair with the dramatic flair that only pre-teens could manage. "I'll never get it right." "You know what your dad told me once?" Victoria said, leaning forward with the conspiratorial tone that adults used when sharing important wisdom with children. "He said that the hardest things are usually the most worth doing, but you have to be willing to fail a few times before you succeed." Emma looked between the two adults who had shaped her understanding of perseverance and kindness. "Is that why you helped Victoria, even though it was scary, Daddy?" David smiled, struck once again by his daughter's ability to cut straight to the heart of complex issues. "That's exactly why, sweetheart. Sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing, but it's still the right thing. And sometimes," Victoria added, "the right thing turns out to be the best thing too, even if you can't see it at the time." Emma nodded solemnly, as if filing away this information for future reference, then returned to the piano with renewed determination. The music that followed was still imperfect, but it was brave in the way that all worthwhile endeavors require bravery. As the years passed, the story of David Thompson and Victoria Ashford became something of a legend in Detroit and beyond. Not because it was extraordinary in its basic elements, one person helping another in a time of need, but because it demonstrated how extraordinary ordinary kindness could become when it rippled outward through a community. The Ashford Foundation's housing projects had revitalized entire neighborhoods, creating not just homes, but ecosystems of support that helped families build stable, prosperous lives. David's approach to construction and community development had been studied by urban planners and social workers who marveled at how incorporating dignity and respect into aid programs dramatically improved their effectiveness. Emma grew up to become a lawyer, specializing in family advocacy, inspired by her father's example and Victoria's experience to protect vulnerable people from systemic abuse. She often spoke at conferences about the importance of listening to those who might appear to have everything, but who might actually have nothing that truly mattered. Victoria never remarried or had children of her own, but she became a beloved aunt figure to Emma and a trusted mentor to countless young people who learned from her that wealth was a tool for building bridges rather than walls. She funded scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and support networks that helped young adults from disadvantaged backgrounds access opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. But perhaps most importantly, both David and Victoria carried with them the knowledge that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the world in ways that policy papers and strategic plans never could. They had learned that the most powerful force in human society was not money or influence, but the willingness of ordinary people to treat each other with extraordinary kindness when it mattered most. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is open a door when someone is knocking. You never know if the person on the other side is someone who needs saving or someone who's about to save you. But one thing is certain, you'll never find out if you leave the door locked. Victoria Ashford would tell you that money can buy many things, but it can't purchase the moment someone looks past their own problems long enough to see yours. And David Thompson would tell you that sometimes the choice to help someone else, even when you can barely help yourself, is the choice that changes everything. The next time you hear someone knocking, remember David's story. Remember that extraordinary moments often disguise themselves as ordinary choices, and that sometimes the person asking for help isn't the only one who needs saving. Remember that kindness is not a luxury that only the wealthy can afford, but a necessity that costs nothing and pays dividends beyond measure. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still has power in our world, and that sometimes opening a door is the bravest thing you can do. Because in the end, we're all just people knocking on doors, hoping someone will answer. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be when you hear that knock? Will you be someone who turns away because it's safer, or will you be someone who opens the door because it's right? The choice, like all the choices that truly matter, is entirely yours. But remember David Thompson, who chose compassion over caution, and Victoria Ashford, who learned that true wealth comes from the connections we make with people who see us as human beings worthy of help. Remember that in a world that often seems divided by differences, the simple act of recognizing our shared humanity can bridge any gap. And remember that sometimes the most important knock you'll ever hear comes at 2 a.m. during a storm, when you're exhausted and worried and have every reason to pretend you didn't hear it. But if you're brave enough to open that door, You might just discover that saving someone else was exactly what you needed to save yourself.